All right, so welcome to part 2 of the Twitter API in Python. In this video, we're going to be touching up some of the code that we wrote in part 1, which I'll link to in the description to this video. Also, you can refer to this playlist, which this video should be a part of, to refer to part 1 as well. So we'll be touching up some code and we'll be focusing on the notion of pagination and also the cursor object in Twitter, specifically the Tweepy library. So we'll be making use of that to do things like accessing our own tweets on our timeline, accessing user tweets from a specific user that we might want to analyze tweets from, also getting followers or friends from certain users and other things like that. So we'll be making use of the cursor class in Tweepy to do that. And before we do that, I just want to go through some things here just to mention that the code, as always, for all of these videos is going to be located on my GitHub repository. So if you go to Twitter Python, there will be a part 2 folder that will contain all of the code in this video. So the code is not currently up, but it will be at the time that I upload this video to YouTube. The other thing is that the main bulk of what we'll be going over is this cursor object, this cursor idea. So we will, I guess I want to leave a link to the description to that in the documentation for Tweepy here. That will be in the description as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get to it. So the first item on the board is to clean up a few things that we did in part 1, just to make things a little bit more streamlined and modular. Before we do that, I do want to import 2 things here at the top, which we'll be making use of in this video. One of them is called API, so from Tweepy import API. The other is called cursor, so from Tweepy import cursor. So once we have those, we're ready to make some changes. So the first thing I want to do is I want to, I think, change the name of this Twitter stream listener class. So before, I guess the initial idea of this class was just to print out the tweet, but this class is doing a little bit more than that. It's also writing it to a file. Standard out listener is probably not the best name for this class since it can do a little bit more than just print it out to the screen. Let's call that something a little bit more general. Let's just call it Twitter listener, which would mean we'll also have to change the reference to that class over here when we make an object called listener. So the next thing that I want to do is I thought that authenticating here in this stream tweets function is fine, but I thought I would abstract this functionality into its own class so that way we can authenticate for other purposes that we may have. Indeed, we'll have those other purposes in this video. So I'm going to create another class up here, which will be for authentication. So I'm going to call this, let's say, Twitter Authenticator, and we'll call the class Twitter Authenticator. And what we'll do in this class is I'm just at this moment going to have a function which will do precisely what these 2 lines do. I just want to extrapolate that into this class. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a function called authenticate Twitter app. It's a class method, so it'll take self as a parameter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to essentially lift these 2 things here and then move them into this function over here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return the auth object that I create in this function. So the plan is in this Twitter streamer class, before we had these 2 lines creating the authentication, what we're going to do now is we're just going to instantiate an object of the authenticator class here in the constructor and then use that object right where we had the previous code. So let me actually just write that out because maybe that's a little bit more clear. So we'll say self.Twitter authenticator. This will be the class object of the authenticator class. And then what we'll do here is we'll just say auth is equal to self.Twitter authenticator .authenticate Twitter app. And that will go ahead and do the same thing that those 2 lines did, but we've just kind of lifted that functionality into a class of its own to make it a bit more modular. So I think that's one of the changes I wanted to make. Let's just go ahead and write this and go ahead and run it to make sure that we didn't break anything. So it looks like that's streaming tweets just as it was before. Seems like that worked out okay. The next thing I want to mention that I didn't before that I thought would be worthwhile to point out is this onError method. Now I did touch on this in part 1 of the video, and I did say that if you encounter an error while you're streaming tweets, this method will be triggered. And in this case, what we're doing here is we're printing the status message of the error. But we might want to do a little bit more checking here, namely Twitter, the Tweepy API imposes these things, well, specifically the Twitter API imposes these things called rate limits. And essentially, if you're throttling the Twitter API, trying to get all this information, and Twitter doesn't like that, it might try to stop you from abusing the system, let's say. So basically, if Twitter thinks that you're doing that, it's going to give you an error message, which is going to be a 420 message. And that's going to be like, hey, if you keep doing this, then we'll essentially kick you. You basically, the first time you get this message, there's a window of time where you have to wait to access the tweets again. And if you keep accessing tweets and you ignore those messages, that window of time increases exponentially. So you could lock yourself out of accessing this information. So it's worthwhile to check that the status message, the error code that you're receiving is not of this form. So what we want to do is we want to say if status is equal to this error code, which is in this case 420, we want to just return false outright. That's it. We just want to kill the connection so that way we don't accidentally boot ourselves from accessing information on Twitter. And I'll just put in a comment here just so if you're looking at this later and you forget what this is for, returning false on data method in case, basically in case rates limit is occurs, let's say. Okay, so that is, I think, all of the changes. Let me just get rid of that extra space there. And that is that. Okay, great. Now we can start into actually making use of the cursor module that we imported there, the cursor class, and also essentially figure out how to use that to extract timeline tweets on your own timeline or a friend's timeline or things of that nature. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create another class, and we'll call this, let's call this class Twitter Client. So it'll be class Twitter Client. And what we'll do here is we will make use, well, I guess let's first create a constructor object, constructor method. And so it's just going to take self at the moment. And what we'll do is we will create an authenticator object. So this is why we created the authenticator class. So we'll say self.auth is equal to Twitter authenticator authenticate Twitter app. So this is just going to be the auth object so that way we can properly authenticate to communicate with the Twitter API. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define another class variable, which we'll call Twitter Client. And this is going to be equal to API, which, as you'll notice, is one of the two things that we imported from Tweepy in this video. And then we'll pass it in the authentication credentials so that way that is authenticated. So we're going to make use of that in the following functions that we'll write in this class. And actually what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to comment these things out, and then we're going to instantiate an object of the Twitter Client class and see what we can do with this. So okay, so let's start off with a function that will allow us to get tweets. So we're going to call this function, I guess, get tweets. And we're going to pass in the parameter self, since this is a class method. And then we're also going to pass in another argument here, which is called num tweets. And this will allow us to determine how many tweets we want to actually show or how many tweets we actually want to extract. So we're going to first do this. We're going to define a list, which is called, let's say, we'll say tweets. Tweets is equal to an empty list. What we're going to do is loop through a certain number of tweets, and then for each one we do, we're going to store that in the list and return that list to the user. So we'll say for tweet in cursor self.twitter.client.user timeline. So I'll explain these things as I go. .items num tweets. Let's actually break this down, what I just wrote here. So we imported cursor. This is a class that will allow us to essentially do what we're about to do, which is get the user timeline tweets. So I should actually call this, let's say, get user timeline tweets. And yeah, let's keep it like that. So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, that client object that we created here in the constructor, there's a method for every object derived from this API class that has this user timeline functionality, and that allows you, specifying a user, to get the tweets off that user's timeline. So we haven't specified a user, and in that case, if you don't specify a user, it just defaults to you. So if that argument is none, which it is by default, then it will just get your own timeline tweets. And then there's a parameter for the cursor object called .items, and that will tell this thing how many tweets to actually get from the timeline. So we can specify that as an argument sent in this function here. So what we'll do in this loop, we're looping through every tweet that this cursor object provides to us, and what we can do is we can say tweet.append. Tweets.append. Tweets is the list that we're storing these things in. .append tweet, and then we can just return the tweets list, and that will now consist of a list of all of the user timeline tweets. So let's go ahead and instantiate a client object and see if that works for our own timeline. So going down to the bottom here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create first, like I mentioned, a Twitter client object. So Twitter client is equal to Twitter client like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to print the function that we just created. So Twitter client.get user timeline tweets. And that takes an argument. That argument is the number of tweets to get. In this case, let's say 5. So let's make sure that works. Let's save that and run it. So we'll see what tweets are on my timeline. So it's got quite a few. So remember, these tweets come in these big blobs. So actually, to make this a little bit more readable, I'm going to replace that number with just 1. So I just want to first clear my screen to make it a little bit easier to read, and then actually go and run this again. This will only get 1 tweet. This whole thing is 1 tweet. And basically this is, if I go to, let's see if I can find some information about this tweet that will distinguish it, and then we'll go to my Twitter profile to verify this actually got the correct tweet. So I see something about samharris.org. Let's see, is there anything else here? Well, let's actually go to my Twitter. Yeah, so it looks like a lot on Sam Harris. So, okay, yeah, let's verify that this is actually the most recent tweet on my timeline has something to do with Sam Harris. So I have my Twitter page up here. This is just my personal Twitter page. Feel free to follow me if you like. No obligation. Anyway, yeah, so there we see this is the most recent tweet that I retweeted from Sam Harris, and it's of the late, great Christopher Hitchens, who, if you're not a fan of, shame on you. He's a really interesting guy, and I encourage you to read about him if you don't know who he is. So this isn't a political channel, but he's amazing. Anyway, so that's that. So yeah, so we've successfully obtained the most recent tweet on my timeline. Great. Now, what if we want to do that for a specific user? So if we want to do this for someone other than myself, how do we do that? Well, we can modify our function a little bit to allow us to specify that information. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable here, which we'll call self.twitteruser is equal to Twitter user. We haven't defined Twitter user yet. We're going to pass that in here as an argument. So basically what we'll do is we'll instantiate an object, a Twitter client object, and what we want to do is we want to allow the person who is using this code to specify a user that they can get the timeline tweets from. And actually, what we're going to want to do is we're going to put in a default argument of none. So if you haven't seen this type of syntax before, if you have like a function like this with an argument that has equal none or equal anything, this is a default argument. And if nothing is specified here for Twitter user, it just defaults to none. And remember, in our case, none, if you don't specify a Twitter user, it will just go to your own timeline. So we want to specify a user, so we will be doing that. So the way that we tell the Tweepy API that we've specified a user is in this cursor function here. This method will say ID is equal to self.twitteruser. So that will do that. So now that will actually get the user timeline tweets for whatever user we specify. So let's go ahead and give that a run to verify that actually worked. So the way that we're going to do that, remember, is instantiate the Twitter client object based on who we want to get the timeline tweets from. So in this case, I'm going to specify based on a user PyCon. What is PyCon? How do I know it's PyCon? Let's go back here. So PyCon, if you're not aware, is a conference that focuses on the Python programming language, and if you're not familiar with it, you should check it out. Again, also on YouTube, all of the talks are available there. Lots of really interesting talks and topics. I highly suggest you check it out. So anyway, this is the user. This is the tweets that we want to obtain the timeline or the home tweets from. And the way that I got PyCon was I just followed the what followed the .@ symbol here. So this is the name of the user of which we wish to extract the tweets from. So let me just minimize that. We've specified that it's PyCon. We'll also get just one tweet from this user. So let's go ahead and write that and run it and see what we get. So let's see, what do we get here? So we get a lot of stuff. Let's just get some identifying information here. Let's see, so is there a text field? So this is the text field. This is generally, in actually the next video, what we'll do is we'll break down what we're looking at here. There's a lot of information here in this tweet. It's not just the text of the tweet, it's the, ID information, the user information, the retweet information, all of this other stuff. So we'll break down precisely what is going on here. But there's a field in this mess which is called text, and this is actually the text of the tweet. So it says all early bird registrations have been claimed, but it's still far from too late to register for PyCon US 2018. So let's verify that this tweet is actually on the timeline. So if we go here, we see that this is the most recent tweet that we extracted. Indeed, all early bird registrations have been claimed, but it's too far from too late to register for PyCon US 2018. Cool. So we have successfully extracted a timeline tweet from another user. So I'm going to mention a couple other functions which are related but different to the user timeline tweet, and they all kind of have a similar form. So I'm just going to, I guess, quickly write those down just so you can have access to them. You can play with them. The form of all of these functions is pretty much the same. So if you understand how this one works, the other ones that I'm going to write, which are just two other ones, should be pretty similar. So the other one that we can do is we can get friend list. So this also will be a class method. We can also determine how many friends we get by a parameter here that we'll set. So this, again, just like we did before, we're going to define an empty friend list, which will store all of the friends for a given user. In this case, I'm not going to specify the user just because I guess it's not really necessary to get the concept of how this thing works. So I'm going to define a loop for friend in cursor self.twitter client.friends items num friends. So just to very briefly go over this, you should see a similar type of idea on line 19 as you do on line 25. So we're looping over Twitter client.friends in this case, not .user timeline, and then we're getting a certain number of friends of that user based on the argument that we pass into the function. And then what we're going to want to do as we loop through is we can say friend list dot append friend, and then we can just return the friend list. So similar concept to what we saw above, just to hammer that pattern or to give you another instance of that pattern that we saw here. We can also get the, let's call it get timeline. We can get home timeline. Let's call it that. Get home timeline tweets. So these are, you have your own tweets that you've tweeted out yourself. The home timeline tweets, those are the ones that if you go to your Twitter page on the home page, you will see all the people that you follow and everything like that. So the top tweet there and following, from there are the home timeline tweets. And we can also extract those for a given user as well. So the pattern there is similar as well. So we'll say self num tweets like that. We'll say, let's say home timeline tweets is the list that we'll store them in for tweets in cursor self.twitter client. So this should look pretty familiar. And we'll say we'll say home, client.home timeline tweets, or just home timeline dot items, and then we'll pass in the number of tweets we wish to get from our home timeline or any user's home timeline that we happen to specify. And then we'll say home timeline tweets dot append tweet, and then we'll return that as well. So these functions all kind of have a similar flavor to them in the way that they work. This get user timeline, sorry about that. This get user timeline here also allows us to specify the ID of the user, and actually we can very quickly do that here as well, just by saying ID is equal to self.Twitter user, and we can also add that onto this one as well. So ID is equal to self.Twitter user. So if you want more information about these API calls, I will also link in the description to this API reference page, which is associated with the Tweepy documentation. So if you want more information on some of these other things that we maybe didn't have so much time to go into, so you can see there's the home timeline function. There's also other parameters that you might be interested in. Instead of getting the number of tweets, perhaps you want to get a certain number of pages from a user or from your own timeline. There's also some other ones. So we saw user timeline. You can get retweets of me, statuses, update statuses. You can update your status via the Tweepy API if you wish to do so. Destroyed status. I mean, there's a ton of things here, and I'm just going to kind of let your imagination go and leave you this page. And if you want to experiment with these things, this is very well documented, and I suggest that you do that. And yeah, so I'll just leave that page in the description to this video. Go ahead and play around with it. Hope this video was helpful for you. Please let me know in the comments if there's any suggestions. And as always, I appreciate the support, subscriptions, and everything else. So thanks again for watching, and have a great day. Bye-bye.